Number 5 on this list is St. Mary's Catholic Church. This is a Catholic church in Nashville, Tennessee that is apparently deeply haunted. World on Fire says there are 3 ghosts rumored to haunt this church and its grounds. One story holds that a priest died during construction of the church. Another story claims that during the Civil War, a Catholic priest serving as a chaplain for the Confederate Army was shot and killed in the church. There's another rumor that the ghost is the spirit of Bishop Richard Pius Miles, the first bishop of Diocese of Nashville, who died in 1860. He was buried in the church basement and supposedly still haunts his old stomping grounds. According to one story from 1937, a pounding at his bedroom door woke up a priest in the rectory, but he could find no one there. After he fell asleep, he was woken up again, this time by a pounding on the headboard of his bed. There was no one in his room, so the awakening was attributed to supernatural causes by superstitious locals. I can't say that I personally would substitute a ghost pounding on my headboard's wake-up call for a regular alarm clock, but hey, whatever gets you out of bed in the morning, right? Nowadays, the 3 ghosts that wander around here are sort of just part of the church and accepted among those who pray and worship here. Apparently these ghosts are relatively calm and won't cause too much trouble other than the occasional midnight stomping, that is. There was, however, one story where the chaplain for the Confederate Army ghost attacked someone. It happened over 50 years ago now, but apparently a woman and her young son were walking past the church and got bombarded by this ghost. They both managed to get out okay, but they were obviously really shaken up. Now, nobody knows why this ghost did this or what the story was, but we think that this woman and her son were descendants of someone who had dealings with him in real life. Potentially their grandfather killed this man or something along those lines. It's all a bit hazy, but the good thing is that's the only group of people his ghost has ever chosen to attack before. Other than that, these ghosts are just relatively annoying, but they shouldn't cause you too much problems if you go here. Number 4 on this list is the widow. There was a widow who lived in the 20th century who was a very devout Catholic. For some reason, this woman, who we're gonna call Ruth, had a very strong connection to the spirits that were in purgatory. Her story goes like this. The first soul Ruth encountered was her departed husband. He had often been impatient during his bout with cancer and had reproached God. One evening, Ruth heard a voice. That happened almost every evening over a long time when she came in from the stable. Then she suddenly recognizes the voice of her husband, but she isn't quite sure yet. Then she kneels down and just prays the rosary. She recommends her husband in particular. Yes, she thinks, he was often rather impatient. Is that perhaps the reason he must still do penance? A few evenings later, she sees a nebulous apparition right in the middle of the room. She takes holy water and prays, "O Lord, give him eternal rest." It makes her very upset, and then she sees her husband. He speaks quietly. "Don't be afraid, Ruth, it's me. I may come here to ask your help. Pray 3 chaplets each day." And then he was gone. So every day she prays 3 chaplets. Each time she adds, "Good God, forgive my husband his impatience when he suffered." After some weeks, her husband stands again in the middle of the room. He looks well. He's friendly and beautiful. She recalls how he was a young man. He says nothing. He only looks at her so grateful and full of love. Then she asks him, "How are you, Jacob?" He answers clearly and quietly, "I'm fine. I may come soon. I thank you, Ruth. I thank you so much." And after this, he never appeared again. So that's a pretty famous story, and Ruth went on to interact with many ghosts like this in purgatory through her life. In fact, some people started to speculate that she may even be a ghost herself as well. Number 3 on this list is the Most Holy Trinity Church. Here we have another Catholic church that's meant for worship, but has been riddled by a haunting. World on Fire says there are a few possible origins of the hauntings that supposedly plague this old parish. One claims that the current church building, built from 1882 to 1885, stands over an old cemetery where some bodies are still buried. Supposedly the ghosts of the folk under the church haunt the building and mysteriously turn lights on and off, open and close doors, and and walk back and forth. Or it could just be living people doing those things, since those activities, believe it or not, are not limited to ghosts. The living can also open doors and turn on lights. At least they could last time I checked. Or maybe I'm a ghost and I don't even know it. Anyways, another source of the ghost legend is that one of the first pastors of the church, Monsignor Michael May, passed away in his bedroom and continues to haunt the church grounds. Apparently, visitors hear mysterious steps at all hours of the night, and dogs have been known to stare as if in a trance at the stairs and dining room of the rectory. In all honesty, dogs staring at things, definitely not indisputable ghostly evidence. I mean, I've seen dogs do some weird stuff before, so I don't think that we can prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt based on their activities. However, it is very important to note nonetheless, whenever a big storm is coming, watch what your animals do. I bet that they'll go and hide or act differently right before a massive thunderstorm or a tornado or something. Us humans, we don't even notice it, we don't sense it at all, but they definitely will. This sort of weird sense, it also translates to ghosts as well, so maybe the dog really is seeing something from the afterlife at this church. Number 2 on this list is Annalise Michelle. This is a very sad story where there may not ever have been any ghosts involved, but they sure thought that there was. Wikipedia says, when Michelle was 16, she experienced a seizure and was diagnosed with psychosis caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. Shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with depression and was treated by a psychiatric hospital. By the time she was 20, she had become intolerant of various religious objects and began to hear voices. Her condition worsened despite medication, and she became suicidal, also displaying other symptoms for which she took medication as well. After the taking of psychiatric medications for 5 years failed to improve her symptoms, Michelle and her family became convinced that she was possessed by a demon. As a result, her family appealed to the Catholic Church for an exorcism. While rejected at first, true priests got permission from the local bishop in 1975. The priests began conducting exorcism sessions, and the parents stopped consulting doctors. Annalise Michelle stopped eating food and died of malnourishment and dehydration after 67 exorcism sessions. Michelle's parents and the 2 Roman Catholic priests were found guilty of negligent homicide and were sentenced to 6 months in jail as well as a fine. This might not be the most terrifying of all of the ghost stories on here, considering the only real ghost involved was the fear that everybody had to begin with. Poor Annalise would have went through absolute agony in her final days when there probably wasn't any paranormal activity to even begin with. And finally, number 1 on this list is St. Rita's Church. Several decades ago, there was one heck of a ghostly interaction that went down at this church. World on Fire says, on All Souls Day in the early 1960s, St. Rita's Parish had a ghostly visitation. More than a dozen parishioners had gathered there to pray when sometime in the early evening the organ began to play by itself. Suddenly, 6 robed monks appeared, 3 wearing black and 3 wearing white. The parishioners attempted to flee, but they found the doors of the church were locked. The phantom monks moved towards the parishioners while the organ continued its dirge. Finally, the vision faded as a disembodied voice whispered, "Pray for us." So next time you see a ghost, it probably just wants to ask you a favor and hopefully not kill you. All they were asking for was a little prayer, which I think everyone would have been more than happy to indulge with at that time. Of course, having a bunch of ghost monks show up out of nowhere, lock all of the doors, and keep you in there, that's pretty terrifying. Everyone is still very wary around St. Rita's Church in case these monks ever do come back.
5. The Walking Dead. My first true tale of phantasmic terror comes to us from Reddit user Jalcott. Answering a question posed in the thread, nurses and doctors of Reddit, what's the weirdest and most paranormal thing you've ever experienced? Hospitals already seem pretty haunted as is, so it's no surprise that there was so many good answers. But Jalcott stood out. Take a listen. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early on in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he didn't talk, but there was no medical reasoning as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the deep south and joined the army when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing, and later officially declared dead. However, 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a Virginia hospital ER in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Deschênes, and I've been dead for 10 years. And according to the Redditor, those were the last words he ever spoke to anyone. He had shown up to the hospital covered in dust and wearing an old uniform that he'd been wearing the night he vanished. His social security had not been used at all, and he had no ID on him whatsoever. However, via fingerprints, they were able to identify him. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whoever was claiming to be him simply wasn't, and asked to never be contacted again." The nurse went on to add that Marion would pace all day, every day, moving his mouth in a way that looked like he was muttering to himself, but nothing came out when he moved his lips. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he was laughing hysterically, but not so much as a breath could ever be heard. The nurse said she tried talking to him almost daily, and he would appear to listen, but only reacts by periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications and treatment plans were pursued, but nothing ever affected him. Therapy was tried as well, but all that would happen was Marion would just grin and start pacing again. She goes on to say that on her last day, she saw Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing back his head to laugh. She closes by saying all those years she'd wondered, was he a ghost? And all those years later, she still doesn't know. Click through and listen to as many top 5 scary videos as your ears can handle. Moving on. Number 4, things that go bunk in the night. Now you would never ever believe this, but our next story comes from Reddit as well. A similar thread, a similar question. What's the most paranormal thing you've ever experienced? Lots of good ones to pick from, but this one from Mad Rampager really stood out for me. I used to be in the military. The training camp bunk that we lived in was said to be haunted. Occasionally, our stuff would go missing and reappear in weird places, like under our bed or inside a bag that we'd zipped up and stuff. No big deal, right? Weird things happen, and I mean human error and all that. Well, then came the instance that freaked everybody out. It was night after lights out, and my friend was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Most of us had been drifting off to sleep and we were lying on our beds when suddenly my friend heard the shuffling of feet from the corridor. So, thinking that it was our sergeant, he quickly hid his phone under his pillow, rolled over on his side, and tried to get to sleep. What happened next still chills me to the bone to this day. While he pretended to sleep, he heard someone right behind him at the other end of the bed saying, "Don't worry, you can continue to pretend to sleep." I could have dismissed this as a figment of his imagination, except me and 5 other people around him heard it. Creepier still, there was no one there. And weirdly, it sounded like the voice of a young girl that had said it. For reference, our camp was in the middle of an island and was set up away from the main admin building. The island had been closed by the government for army training purposes for the past 15 years, so there were definitely no civilians around, let alone any children. To make matters freakier, when we came back from our weekend home leave, there was a bunch of hair on his bed, neatly bundled up, long and jet black, and underneath his pillow was a note. Remember me? Now, as I said, we're in the middle of a forest, in the middle of an island, and at that point in time, there were no female recruits whatsoever on the island. Our bunks were locked for the weekend, and the duty sergeant had no idea what had happened. We never spoke about it again after that night, and it still chills me every time I think about it. Number 3, old friends. Our next story is from a Reddit thread asking, "What's your ghost story?" And I gotta point this one out just because it was too funny, but the original poster included the title in brackets, "Serious?" to deter any would-be paranormal pranksters. Just serious ghost stories, please. Luckily, Redditors obliged. User Barbed Cats shared this terrifying tale. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town, I see someone on the side of the road flagging me down. Up in the North Woods, no one ever leaves someone else stranded, and it would turn out that the guy standing there was somebody I'd actually been to school with, my old friend Jim. Jim gets in the car and we start talking, catching up. I hadn't seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe just a little bit older. We get to town and I ask him if he wants to come to the reunion with me and have a drink. He says no, just take me back home. Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the part of town that really was just the outskirts, up by the fairground and the cemetery. There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured that must be where he lived. When we reached the end of the turn, he said, "Just drop me off here. It was nice to see you again," and he walked off into the night. So I went to the high school reunion, met up with some old classmates, and we start to talk. Now please understand me here. I am stone cold sober, nor do I ever take anything harder than soda. Tired after a 13-hour flight, but I was completely sober. As we were talking about who was showing up and who wasn't, I mentioned to my old classmate that I just picked Jim up a few miles off east of town and had dropped him up by the fairgrounds. Now for some reason everyone got really quiet. Even the guy belting out karaoke stopped, and my cousin went white as a shirt. Barb. Jim died 8 years ago. Rolled his car. I start to feel really dizzy, and I go out to the car to take some deep breaths and decide whether or not I'm going crazy. And there on the seat was a newspaper printed 8 years ago containing Jim's obituary. I still have that damn paper. Every now and again I take it out to stare at it, and I still wonder just what the hell happened that night. Number 2. Ghost on the line. The next story comes to us from a thread asking law enforcement officers of Reddit what is the creepiest call that you've ever been on. We get a very creepy answer from user Smokey Bonaparte sharing this creepy little tale. The Redditor writes, 911 dispatcher calling in. We received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her before and her husband in the past, so I recognized the voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulances advised that they had a 15-minute ETA as she was in a very rural part of West Virginia. I'm talking to her just about her husband and how she was doing, and just making pretty standard small talk with her. The ambulance arrives and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to her door to go answer the door, and she says okay and hangs up the phone. Oh, that's pretty normal, right? Well, here's where it gets very weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute after, and they say that no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address, and he's breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by, and the paramedic on scene radios to ask me who called. I tell him it was the elderly woman who lived on residence. He tells me he's going to call this in and he needs to speak with my shift supervisor. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the same information I relayed, that it was all correct, and asks what's going on. Apparently the old woman had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back for them and confirmed it was the old woman who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. But I took a call from a ghost that day. Number 1. Uninvited Guest. Closing off our list is this story which chilled my spine like Sub-Zero. Coming to us from user Parole Model, which hey, by the way, love the pun. It was from an Ask Reddit thread asking, what's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you? Lots and lots and lots of good ones, but this one took the cake. So lend an ear. I used to visit my friend at her house out in a rural farming area before she moved. I'd sleep over a lot and we'd just hang out and draw. I usually slept in the living room and on the couch, and there were 2 mirrors in the room that were fairly close to the TV. When the TV was off and I was walking by, I started seeing shadows move behind me. I thought it might just be something off the TV screen, and then one evening I walked into the living room to get my sketchbook so I could sketch in her bedroom. I bent over and picked it up, stood up straight, and I looked in the mirror and saw a man behind me. A man standing in the hallway leading to the living room. He was average height, bald, and a bit old. I turned to look at him and no one was there. I turned to look at the mirror again and he was gone. I felt more than a little spooked. Another time we were just sitting in the living room and we heard what sounded like a kid's footsteps running across upstairs quickly. She had 2 adult siblings, but they were out at work leaving us all alone. Around that time I decided to sleep in my friend's room instead of the living room, only to wake up in the middle of the night to see 4 posters slowly get peeled off the wall. No, it wasn't just them falling and dragging each other down. It looked as if someone was carefully unsticking the tape and removing them. The next morning my friend put them back up saying, well, I need to get some better tape. She and her family eventually moved out because they couldn't afford to keep living there anymore. We'd never really talked about anything that had happened in that house, as if talking about it might actually make it worse. But after she moved, I finally confronted her and said it. I said, dude, your house was haunted. I hope you knew that. She replied, yeah, we knew it was. Some guy and his granddaughter used to live there, but he took her life and then took his own. So it was probably them or something. I never told you because I didn't want to scare you. Later, she would dig out a copy of a news article she got from a local paper about the crime. The picture that went with the article was the exact man I saw all those years ago. Okay. I gotta start looking at some of the cute cat picture subreddits, or maybe ones with like little monkeys going on adventures after that. Need to clear myself out. But thanks for everything, my viewers. Catch you in the
5 on this list is Stull's Gateway to Hell. Anything named Stull was just doomed from the start, guys. Thrillist says the tiny town of Stull has counted very few residents since it was founded in 1856. The most famous is rumored to be Lucifer himself, who some say appears at the town cemetery on Halloween and spring equinox. They say he uses the site where a roofless church once stood as a portal to and from hell. Some say that he's drawn to the site of frequent witch hangings. Others believe one of the graves actually contains Satan's own child. Either way, new graves continue to be dug despite signs warning against trespassers, perhaps referring directly to the Prince of Darkness himself or the cults that are rumored to flock to the grounds. The first published article about the horrors are traced back to a 1974 article in the University Daily Kansan, though whispers about evil have persisted since 1900 or so. In 1998, the hanging tree was torn down to stop people from visiting. It hasn't lessened the need for a small town to bolster an annual police presence to deter visitors looking for a glimpse of the devil himself. So we have witch hangings here, we have cults that flock here, and then we also have the worst thing of all, the literal devil potentially calling this place home. How could somebody decide to name a town Stull? That is way too close to the word skull and it's just destined for failure. People have been smart enough not to live here all that much, and as Thrillist has said, the residents are few and far between, but it doesn't change the fact that this place is deeply haunted. If the devil truly does live here and there is a portal to hell, then there's no telling what other crazy things can happen here. Maybe there are few residents around because the devil has been taking them. I also think it's interesting that there are more police around this place. Why would there be a bunch of police around an area where there isn't that many people? Maybe the government knows something about this place that we don't. Maybe they're hiding something and don't want locals finding out. It's just a theory, but based on the rumors around this place, I could believe it. Number 4 on this list is the Devil's Chair. I am perfectly happy with my lazy boy and don't need to be sitting on any type of devil's chair anytime soon. Insider says the legend of the Devil's Chair goes like this. An old farmer in Alma refused to sell his land to the city in order to build a new cemetery. Someone got a little too tired of waiting for him to sell, so he was pushed into his own well. Eventually, somebody said that there was a terrible smell coming from the well, so the city sent someone to investigate. It was ruled that the well was empty and it was boarded up. Now, if you make your way to Alma, you can actually sit on the boarded up well, but legend says that people who have sat on the well have been known to mysteriously disappear. Where the heck did my dude go? He was down there in the well and then just poof, he was gone. Like, did his body go underwater and just couldn't be seen, or was there something more paranormal afoot? Well, whatever happened to the body, I guess it doesn't matter too much now because there is certainly something paranormal happening here today. If you sit on this chair, you will literally go missing. Yeah, maybe let's stop sitting on the haunted well that people have named the Devil's Chair. Maybe, I don't know, let's put a fence around it, or better yet, let's just destroy the damn thing. Number 3 on this list is Sawyer Castle. Sawyer Castle is currently haunted by the ghosts of 2 lovers who left this world far too soon. Ranker says, this haunted Kansas mansion has many gruesome tales attached to it, but certainly the most awful one involves the tragic suicides committed by a husband and wife during the Civil War. The owner of the house had gone to fight and instructed his wife to wait for the arrival of a particular ferry that he would be coming home on. When her husband did not return on that ferry, she assumed him dead and hung herself in the bell tower. However, he was in fact still alive, and upon his arriving home, he found his wife dead and killed himself out of misery. It's said that strange lights and noises emanate from the house's bell tower to this day. This story is very similar to that of a classic play, Romeo and Juliet. 2 lovers, held apart by something out of their control, take their own life in what is a clear miscommunication. Even though this was horrible, I suppose that they sort of got what they wanted. Now they're together forever, but just in ghost form. Of course, they can't just let this lie though and have to haunt this place and ruin everyone else's life who's still living here. Maybe they think that because they're still together and technically still around, that they should own the home, and anyone in it that's not them is a trespasser. Whatever it is that they think, they make it very difficult for those who go around here. I'd avoid this place altogether if I was you. Number 2 on this list is Fort Leavenworth. What happened here back in the day is enough to make anyone's hair raise. Ranker says Fort Leavenworth is considered to be one of the most haunted army bases in the US, and it's home to a number of helpful and malignant spirits. It has seen centuries of war and is home to a military prison called the United States Disciplinary Barracks. During World War II, there was a prisoner uprising, and as punishment for their unruliness, one prisoner was hung every hour for 14 hours. They quickly ran out of space in the gallows and also used one of the elevator shafts in the administration building to hang people. Ever since then, screams have been heard from that same elevator shaft at odd hours. Not surprisingly, nearly every building on the base has a horrifying story attached to it. I know that it was war and they were trying to have an uprising, but my gosh, hanging one person an hour? Like, that is just so brutal. No wonder this place is deeply haunted now. All of the spirits from back then are locked into this place and refuse to let go. And you better believe that they make the people who are still around pay for what happened in the past. People have reportedly been attacked by invisible spirits before. They've been clawed at and bitten, and one person even had their finger ripped right off of their body. Things are not pleasant at this army base, and I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't been razed to the ground yet. Might be the only thing left to do to quiet these spirits down. And finally, number 1 on this list is the ghost of Saline River. You already know that this is going to be a scary legend when they have a name like that. Ranker says, according to legend, a Native American ghost by the name of Takaluma is said to walk the banks of the Saline River and was first spotted by a cowboy in the winter of 1879. Takaluma's spirit was condemned to wander the river until he found the skull of his dead father, who had been murdered by white men in the 1840s. The ghost rose from his burial mound and warned that far more powerful spirits might join in the search, but the skull has still never been found. What a horrible fate. Your father gets murdered, and then you have to spend the rest of your existence as a ghost wandering around this river searching for his skull. This ghost was once a calm presence, but time has made Takaluma angry. Now it's said that this ghost will drag unsuspecting victims into the river and drown them, then take their skull and see if he can convince the other spirits that it's his father's. This has never worked before, but when you have a literal eternity, I suppose you'll try anything. A beautiful river to look at from a distance, but not one that you want to get too close to.
At number 5, House of Leaves, Mark Z. Danielewski. And you may be thinking, what the F, Jack? House of Leaves? I'm expecting some 200-year-old novels at the least. I want some top hat and cane style gothic horror, or at least a mad monk of sorts. Hey, listen, gothic horror is a tried and tested medium, but like I said at the start of this video, you need to know the rules in order to break them. And Mark Danielewski's phenomenal novel is as mind-boggling and intriguing as it is terrifying. I don't say this lightly, but House of Leaves is a work of art. It really is, and whilst on the surface, and then some, this is certainly a horror novel, it is also far, far more than that. Written by Mark Z. Danielewski and released back in the year 2000 as his debut novel, House of Leaves is a story unlike any that you've ever read before. It is told by a frame within a frame within a frame, kind of. It is told initially through the eyes of Johnny Truant, a tattoo artist and professed unreliable narrator. As he is searching for a new apartment, he stumbles upon the home of the recently deceased Zampano, a blind and elderly man who lived alone. There he finds Zampano's old belongings, one of them being a manuscript of a documentary film called The Navidson Record. And here is where we hit the gothic of gothic horror. The film is, in fact, the documentation of a young family, the Navidsons, who after returning home from a trip, noticed something strange about their house. It's gotten bigger, and not just in the feng shui type of deal, but it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, and then it can't stop growing. Now, I'll say no more because reading House of Leaves is akin to being a detective, getting absorbed by these strange, terrifying layers of information told through the eyes of characters who are as perplexed as we are. And this is where the gothic horror is subverted by this novel. It takes that trope, the haunted house, and it delivers it in a completely alien and impossibly foreign way. It irks on cosmic horror but never quite goes there, allowing us to get as lost in the same maze as its many narrators. Reading this novel is a task in itself. It is ergodic in its execution, but that's part of its appeal. It's claustrophobic at best and paranoid at its worst. Do you want to dissect gothic horror in the 21st century? read this book. Swinging in at number 4, The Woman in Black, Susan Hill. And of course this novel has to appear on our list, and truth be told, I thought long and hard about the best in class of the traditional haunted house ghost story. Of course, this same novel could stand amongst Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, The Mysteries of Udolpho, or even Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, but I think in terms of pure execution, as well as a genuinely terrifying example of gothic horror, Susan Hill's 1983 novel The Woman in Black stands above the rest. And again, you might be thinking, come on Jack, I want some 18th century stuff, stop playing games. But I'd say, hey, gothic horror is alive and well, and 1983 was a pretty terrifying year. Written by Susan Hill, the remarkable author who had released several brilliant works of horror, The Woman in Black tells the tale of a man named Arthur Kipps, a retired solicitor who one night is telling ghost stories with his wife and 4 stepchildren, but when he's asked for his scariest story, he snaps back to a time in his younger days and he turns white as a sheet. You see, many years earlier, Kipps is summoned to a small market town on the northeast coast of England to attend the funeral of Mrs. Alice Drablow, an elderly and reclusive widow who lived alone in the desolate and secluded Eel Marsh house for many years. Which obviously, if you've seen the 2012 movie starring Daniel Radcliffe, or perhaps the long-running stage adaptation, you'll certainly be familiar with. But the truth of the matter is, the spirit of this novel captures something truly gothic in its approach, something that is otherwise difficult to do on screen. As we peel through the pages of Hill's novel, we are just as curious and confused as Arthur Kipps himself, willing him to leave town, but at the same time unable to stop turning the page. With The Woman in Black, Hill held a mirror to many of the traumas found in Gothic literature and applied them to an otherwise completely modern retelling. It's almost as if Hill took all of the tropes set out by her predecessors and then decided to just turn the fear factor up a notch. Next up at number 3, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde. And I was umming and ahhing about our 3rd spot on this list, and so let it be known that this was a close toss-up between this entry and Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, a posthumous collection of his many brilliant short stories, but I think it's probably best that we include full novels here. Just a little side note, but know that Poe is well and truly recognised. Anyway, talking of a gothic portrait of a man's life in literature, let's talk about The Picture of Dorian Gray, which, horror aside, is just a remarkable novel by all accounts, as well as being a deeply philosophical musing on the nature of the individual. Who would know it then that at the time of this publication in 1890, The Picture of Dorian Gray was pretty much trashed by critics. Really, it was well and truly torn to shreds, as well as being massively censored by Wilde's editor without his knowledge. But come on guys, of course it was going to take a few decades for people to realise the importance of a horrifying portrait and a well-kept secret. The tale, which many of you will be familiar with, is an observation of hedonism in the pursuit of pleasure, and yet the eternal price that we all pay for a life of decadence. And also, well, you know, selling your soul to the devil for the price of immortality, but that kind of goes without saying. Obviously we're talking about the metaphorical devil because this is gothic horror, and heaven and hell don't serve too much of a purpose on the mortal plane. The novel details the young aristocrat Dorian Gray, whose portrait is painted by the artist Basil Hallward, which through supernatural means ages the painting instead of himself. His body retains perfect youth and vigour, whilst the portrait grows into a hideous record of evil that he must keep hidden away from the rest of the world. Now, listen, this tale is sprawling in its approach and takes perhaps a little more work than some of the rest of the novels on this list, but there's no other way about it. The very essence of The Picture of Dorian Gray is gothic horror. Coming in at number 2, The Monk, Matthew Lewis. Alright guys, I'm pretty sure that some of you jumped into this video with the intention of discovering something truly messed up. And yeah, this is that novel. And for a story written in 1796, yes, 1796, this story could give most modern horror movies a run for their money. Written by Matthew Gregory Lewis when he was just 20 years old, The Monk in many ways exemplifies how and why gothic horror first came about. In the oversaturation of romanticism and literature of the time, in the many tales of love loss and sweeping, domineering landscapes, many writers and readers were just bored. They were just straight up bored, man. Well, I mean the aristocracy were bored because, come on guys, we plebs were too busy working in the fields and fighting wars to read. And particularly in regard to the birth of the male Gothic, this audience wanted some scandal. Now it probably goes without saying, but The Monk was absolutely savaged by critics at the time, mainly for its obscenity, incest, murder and eroticism. Yeah, you get the picture. It tells a tale of a man named Ambrosio, an incredibly devout monk who as a small child was left on the doorstep of a monastery and was perceived as a gift from the Virgin Mary by the monks that lived there. In other words, this man is piety incarnate. Or should I say was? Because guess what? He succumbs to the temptations of a young girl who enters the monastery disguised as a young boy and then leads him down a path of sorcery, murder and torture, generally tearing down all pillars of purity and goodness with every turn. Obviously the Monk is very much a tale of its time, and from an analytical perspective it offers an incredibly narrow worldview, but this novel pretty much defined many motifs of Gothic horror, as well as the perception of the church later down the line in horror fiction as a whole. I mean, the reason behind the success of this novel was down to the scandal that it caused and the sensationalism that it later garnered, but in the actual bones of this tale, The Monk in many ways is a masterpiece of Gothic fiction. Its approach is widely psychological and its execution is the very tactile fear of the physical. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. And this is a rare moment where I hold up the obvious choice at the very tip top of the pile. There is no other way to say it. Frankenstein is the finest Gothic horror novel ever written. Still, to this day. And as I briefly mentioned at the opening of this video, this spot should certainly be reserved for the greats, Bram Stoker's Dracula included, but even when compared to that particular novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is in a league of its own. Let me put it this way, whilst Walpole's The Castle of Otranto certainly was the first depiction of Gothic horror literature, and whilst Matthew Lewis's The Monk fleshed out those very same themes, it was this novel that truly defined them. And how did all of that start? In a lake house in Geneva, surrounded by renowned writers Lord Byron, her future husband Percy B. Shelley, John Polidori and several others, they decided to see who could create the scariest horror story. And Mary Shelley, who had never written a novel before, blew them all out of the water. Frankenstein. And I don't need to tell you about this tale because without doubt you'll all be familiar with it, but really if you haven't actually sat down and read this novel, I implore you to do so. You see, not only did this novel give life, literally, to the ongoing pursuit of Gothic horror, it also gave rise to science fiction in horror, as well as sci-fi as a whole. Frankenstein was the start of many things. Mary Shelley took the themes of the Gothic, the sweeping landscapes, the base exploration of the forbidden and the breaking of cultural and societal taboos, and she said, we can go one further. We don't have to be resigned to the fact that horror is simply a pursuit or a simulation of the things that we should or shouldn't do. It isn't just about surface morality. Gothic horror is much more important than that. It asked, what does it mean to be human? How far can civilization go in tampering with nature? What is the ultimate price of creating a monster in pursuit of pretending to be a god? Whilst it may not seem it through her novel's immortality, Mary Shelley continues to challenge us by asking these questions. And now, in many ways, this story is more relevant than ever before.